Michael Jordan collapsed on the floor, sobbing in grief after winning the NBA championship. Tiger Woods weeping on his caddy's shoulder after his own griefy win. Mikaela Shiffrin in tears after her Olympic gold redemption, years after grief knocked her off her perch. This is what grief looks like when we give it crucial permission to be here, when death defines sports. And in today's episode of Death on the Daily, we're going to be looking at how sports can be one of the biggest theatres where we honour our collective grief. This is a space where we'll see stadiums full of rival fans and teams coming together to connect and to support those who are grieving. But also an arena where a griever's experience of loss can be heightened under all of those stadium spotlights. So let's look at these 5 ways that death has defined sports, including showing us what happens when we allow our grief to take up the stadium-sized space in our society that it truly deserves. So let's start with Michael Jordan. In July of 1993, Michael's father, James Jordan Sr., was tragically murdered. Michael had described him as his rock and his best friend. Devastated and needing a break, Michael announced his retirement from basketball that October. This was a shock retirement whilst he was flying at the top, having just won his 3rd straight title with the Chicago Bulls. Michael walked away from basketball to pursue a career in baseball. This was a beautiful way that he continued his bond with his dad after his death, because baseball was his father's ultimate dream for him. Michael returned to the court in 1995 with the Chicago Bulls, and they won the championship in 1996. In this first championship that he won after his father's death, he allowed his grief to roar. He took the game ball, he collapsed onto the locker room floor, and he just allowed all of the tears to flow. This raw, griefy moment is iconic in the career of this GOAT. And it really strikes me that this game was 3 years after his father was murdered. We live in a world where we're told to move on from our grief, that our grief has an expiry date. We often think of athletes like Michael Jordan as superhuman, but what he showed here is that he's so deeply human. Just like any of us, we all grieve. Similarly, in 2006, we witnessed a similar iconic emotional moment with Tiger Woods at the Open. Tiger's father, Earl, was his first coach, his mentor, his emotional support. And when Earl died of cancer in May that year, Tiger had taken 9 weeks off. He returned for the US Open and he missed the cut. In later years, he acknowledged that grief was a big part of his drop in form and him missing out on the US Open. And I want to really normalize that these drops in performance is so valid and it's very common in our grief. And just 1 month later, Tiger went on to win the Open, sobbing on his caddy Steve Williams' shoulder after his win. And later revealing that as they were coming up to the last hole, that Steve said to him, "This one's for Dad." And as this news article reports so powerfully, sometimes when we're going through our hardest times, and we just keep on going through our grief, those weeks can end up being our most gratifying ones. Tiger here gives us a permission slip that honouring our loved ones is always valid and always welcome. Next up, I wanted to talk about Liverpool FC and their collective grief after the tragic death of Diogo Jota. We often talk about grief driving those big wins, the success stories, that redemption arc, just like I've just done with Tiger Woods and with Michael Jordan. But it's just as important to acknowledge that grief can cause a big dip in our performance that can last for some time. When Liverpool FC lost Diogo Jota, as well as obviously the tragic death of his brother too, just before the start of last season, it rocked the club, the fan base and the international football community. The collective grief was palpable, from the tributes outside of Anfield to the tributes that the fans led in every game. And inside the team, we could see the impact of collective grief. And this response to grief that we saw, which ultimately culminated in a drop in performance, is really normal in grief. And I was heartened to see some, not all, of the media compassionately calling this out for what it was. It was performance impacted by grief. And whether you are elite athletes collectively mourning one of your fellow players, or whether you're any of us, the impact of grief on us and our body is huge. Grief drains our battery. It brings on brain fog, affects our focus and our cognitive abilities. It zaps our physical energy. It can affect our reaction times, and it can change our relationship. It can create fractures in teams that were once harmonious. It can cause eruptions of anger. It can take away our motivation and so much more. And expecting a group of humans who've just been through a sudden and tragic death to carry on like normal without a dip in form is unrealistic. And I know that Liverpool FC sadly weren't given as much grace as I would hope any human who's grieving could be given. But this is your permission slip, that if you're grieving, if your world has been turned upside down, if you're feeling it through your body, if you've had a dip in performance, feeling foggy and exhausted, perhaps your identity has shifted, you don't know who you are right now. The permission slip here is to know that it's grief, it's valid. So give yourself all of that grace, that compassion, and seek out all of that kindness, care, and support of others. And then next up, we have another athlete who normalizes the fact that grief can knock us off that top spot, but also gives us that glimpse into that forwards path, the fact that there will be more successes. The greatest alpine skier in history, Mikaela Shiffrin, experienced a similar drop in form after her dad Jeff tragically died. At the 2022 Winter Olympics, after her dad's death, she unexpectedly crashed out of multiple events and she left empty-handed. And Mikaela's spoken openly and really normalized that grief brain, the fogginess that we get as a result of our grief. Plus, she's also acknowledged the big identity shift and how you're a completely different person on the other side of loss. Her story is so powerful because through everything that she shared about her grief, she's really normalized this experience. She showed us we don't need to move on quickly. There's no pressure to bounce back quickly, but that the path ahead does hold more gold medals and all of those successes and goals that we can keep going for if we give ourselves the space and the grace with our grief. She eventually returned to form and broke the all-time World Cup record, as well as getting back to Olympic gold. Getting back to that top was a process that took years. And in a world where we assume we'll move on from grief in a matter of weeks, that there should be an expiry date, Mikaela again has given us a really powerful permission slip that we don't have to move on from grief, with permission to give ourselves all of that space and that grace and to be so deeply human. And finally, I want to talk about a story from the news that has hit me so deeply. Baby loss is a topic that's so close to my heart as a bereaved mother. And I know from my own personal experience that baby loss is very much a taboo. It's death outside of the natural order, and as a result, most people in our world don't quite know how to hold this conversation or lean in and be there and be present with it. But when Dutch footballer Mats Seuntjens and his partner Elba tragically lost their daughter Celine Inea as a newborn, I was so heartened at how a whole stadium lent in and held them in their grief. Because when Matt stepped back onto the pitch at NAC Breda just a few days later with Elba watching, the stadium and his team didn't pretend that his grief wasn't there. They stood right alongside them and honoured their baby girl Celine Inea in the stadium-sized celebration that any baby deserves. They held up sparklers, they sang, they unfurled banners that read her name, as well as saying, "Heaven's gained a little star." As a bereaved mother, I cried watching this because this is exactly what any grief, but also specifically taboo topics like baby and child loss needs. We need people who are willing to stay present and in the room with us, even if we're crying. And this is where community gathering around us in our worst moments can really give us some beautiful permission slips. Those permission slips of all of the space that our babies deserve to take up in this world. So that completes our 5 times that death has defined sports. And I wanted to just connect us into that shared truth underneath them all. At the heart of every sports team, of every sports fan, is a shared humanity. Because even though we can see these athletes as superhuman, as super composed, ultimately they too are humans just like all of us. And we all are humans who are here and we've loved. And therefore, when we're grieving, that love and our grief deserves to take up space. So if you're holding grief in any way, whether it's knocked you way off performance, whether you just feel a little bit out of sorts, I just hope that today's episode has given you some permission slips to meet yourself and your grief exactly where you are, and to give yourself all of the grace, the compassion, the care, and this community support that you need. And just to say a massive thank you for joining me today on Death on the Daily. And if this episode resonated, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, including if there are any other athletes or anyone else whose grief story you think that the world needs to know. And while you're there, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and you will never miss another episode of Death on the Daily. But above all else, wherever you are in your journey, I hope that you can be kind to yourself and know that I'm sending you love.